Welcome to another edition of Expanding Mind. I'm your host, Eric Davis. I'm going to continue to look at the cultures of consciousness today. I've been thinking more and more about the relationship between art and religious experience, or ritual and religious experience. And it's kind of come from the sense that I've always been fascinated by religion, like I think some people, although some people don't have that, and always attracted to the more vivid and exotic edges of it. And it took me a while to realize that it wasn't altogether clear to me whether what I was really seeking for in my exposure to ritual and sacred architecture and grimoires of magical diagrams was actually something that was ultimately as aesthetic as it was mystical or supernatural or metaphysical. And I'm still not really sure, because I guess I enjoy that space of ambiguity. But one thing that that attitude of the aesthetic kind of gave me is a sort of way to go in and truly appreciate a lot of religious material that freaks out a lot of people, because they feel like if they somehow get into it or get something out of it, that means they believe it. So then you get these people going to a Christian church and they're all like hostile because they think it's bunk or something, and so they can't really appreciate what the people there are doing. Whereas I love to be in a kind of situation. You just go in and you're like, well, what's the scene here? And you get a sense of the emotions, and you get a sense of the symbolism and the ritual and this kind of sense of drawing together a human community. It can be extremely powerful, even if you keep a pretty secular frame of mind at the heart of hearts, which is also not even necessary, to the process, because even people who are deeply into religion, esoterica, the occult, often approach there through art, and we've talked about that a lot on this show, how art practice itself can be a path. And lucky for the rest of us, we get to enjoy the works that come out of that path, which makes the interlap of aesthetics and mysticism and esoterica, I think, a particularly rich one to look at. And today we're going to be talking to an artist whose recent book is dense with the mysteries. Ron Regé is an L.A. cartoonist whose new book, which we'll be talking about in greater detail, the Cartoon Utopia, is partly inspired by Ron's attendance for our co-host Maja Daouz's magic school lectures in Los Angeles. So it's a nice what goes around comes around kind of thing. So with that, let's bring on our co-host here, Maja. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Eric. How's it going?
It's going good. I'm sitting here leafing through, yet again, as I've been doing for the last week or so, Ron's beautiful big book of black and white drawings, cartoons, cosmic cartoons, full of vibrating lines, radio-magnetic-looking energies, crystals, suns and moons, figures, a kind of pop Blakeanism here. Where did you first meet Ron?
Oh, man. It's funny because the first time I met Ron, it was as a fan of his at a comic convention, which, truth be told, as many of the listeners may know, I am a total comic geek. And I first became aware of Ron with his book Skibber Be By, which, if you guys haven't ever seen or read Skibber Be By, it's just a beautifully done, heartbreaking narrative that was so brilliant and smart that I had to go and hunt him down and get an autograph from him. So the first place I met him was at a zine comic convention.
Well, you did esoteric comics yourself.
I did. At the time, I was making some little zines that had, their fair share of popularity. So I was shilling those at the same time as really kind of getting involved with some other comics folks, like Sammy Harcum was a friend of mine, too, at the time, who now runs and owns Family Bookstore in Los Angeles. That's a great place to kind of investigate esoteric and religious comics.
Well, that's great. Well, with that, let's bring on Ron to the show. Ron, welcome to Expanding Mind.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So I'd love, just because we didn't talk too much about your earlier work and your kind of how you sort of got some recognition on your earlier comics and then coming out this book, is to maybe kind of contrast it or put it in context of the work you did before, which had a more explicitly autobiographical element in some respects and had in some ways different concerns, but in some ways you can kind of see the explosion of esoteric interest that you have in the new book kind of come out of earlier stuff. So maybe just talk a little bit about your evolution of your work.
Well, I think as a cartoonist, I always had this kind of philosophical yearning as to what I was doing. I was always kind of asking big questions, whether it was with autobiography or with the stories that I was telling. I was always also trying to push the medium of never doing very straight-ahead things with anything that I was working on, and it all kind of developed into, I kind of like hit a wall where I thought I might be done with comics, and I didn't want to write stories anymore. I wasn't interested in characters or narratives or anything like that, and I just started taking notes, and a lot of esoteric things I was looking at, and then suddenly was like, oh, there's a whole universe of things that I don't see represented in comics that well, and it kind of put me back into doing it.
Yeah, it's... Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, what you just said, Ron, could be applied really across the board with how people engage in storytelling. That if you look at all the remakes of bad movies that Hollywood is doing right now, it's like the same kind of recycled stuff, whereas there's all this vast amount of information and stories and some of the esoteric occult information that no one is going anywhere near touching. So instead of like re-putting out another Beethoven movie, you can address
that was always a little bit interesting to me, and I've even recently, every few years I keep trying to read Doctor Strange over and over again. And I still, even as a kid, I was like, this seems really interesting, but I just don't like it. And I read it recently, and it's almost like they did a lot of really hard work to make sure there's nothing truly esoteric in there.
Yeah.
Or if it's with you, I don't know. When you say with Doctor Strange, though, you start to think about what is, like when you say there's nothing truly esoteric in there. It's interesting because you get to this problem about the role of images themselves. So it's like their lore is all concocted. It's like the fake, style of Tibetan stuff mixed with, potted, half-remembered ideas from ceremonial magic, like on any kind of content level. But as a deployment of images, that's what's so amazing about that stuff, is that the guys who were making it were not heads, for the most part, and they were just letting their imaginations rip. And then they become these places where people start going, wow, magic is really possible. And it sort of feeds into like something that's more like a real occult. So it's such a strange mixture. But you really spent a lot of time in the new book like trying to depict these very abstract metaphysical situations. There's a lot of drawings of patterns, of cosmic diagrams, of radiating forces of light, not just normal human figures. It becomes almost claustrophobic at some point. So how are you thinking about, in a good way, like just dense, with like the way that dreams can be overwhelming with lines of light and that. What were kind of the things that you were trying to bring through in the actual images you were drawing that had some of that magical character?
I think it's just the nature of how I draw, really, and something that I've developed over the last 20 years. So for me, that's just the way I draw. And it was more about putting the content in. One thing that I did try to do that's actually talking about those other things is I did kind of want to keep specificity, really specific things out of it. where I don't have a lot of astrology in there, and I did decide not to put a lot of symbols or, chakra systems or that kind of stuff in the book, because I felt like if I was going to delve into that stuff with imagery, that I don't consider myself much of an expert. I'm more of a generalist, and I didn't want to, get anything wrong, or I wanted to make it very, very general as to what I was doing. As far as the style that I draw or the way that my lines look, I feel like that probably just developed separately over the development of my style.
Yeah, that's another thing I really liked were the things that you chose to include in it, because when a lot of people, like Erik was saying with Dr. Strange, there's those stereotypical things that people will think of when they think of the occult and esoteric, which are, some remnants of a ritual activity, or like, boobs and candles and black cats and stuff like that. But the topics that you chose to go weren't like, astrology or chakras, but they were more like kind of contained in the more base, like almost like atomic structure of a lot of the ideas of occultism. Do you feel like you kind of were drawn more to those on purpose, or why do you think like a lot of the stuff was more about like kind of the underlying structure of it instead of the more common symbols like occultism or things like that?
I think because I found myself finding that the underlying structures were so fascinating, and that's what really kind of got me fascinated. And it's interesting to think of something like a lot of the way that magic and witches or wizards or things have been, almost everything in science fiction and mystical culture and all of that stuff is represented in culture as if it's just pretend, that it's all pretend. I mean, if there being any reality or basis for any of it seemed utterly fascinating to me, and also it was like being revealed to me for the first time in my life, right at when I was actually starting to become bored with such things. I was like, this science fiction fantasy isn't that exciting to me as it used to be, and I'm like, wait a minute, there's some reality to it, and that's really exciting. And then I suddenly didn't understand why this entire universe, and I always think about Comic-Con because it's so soul-crushing for me to go there. Because it's such you're in this air-conditioned hangar with these lights, and there's just so much product and plasticness, and the people seem there's not a good vibe there at all. People seem pretty downtrodden and petty and caught up in very strange things that are based on this fantasy, and the idea that there could actually be anything real and helpful to them is so separated from it. So I wanted to make a little attempt of bringing the two together.
Yeah. So your feel is that there there's obviously so much fantasy in comic books and cartooning
and in popular culture.
Yeah, in popular culture in general, there's more of it there, and clearly that fantasy is sometimes directly about the occult. Sometimes it's a sort of displaced expression of occult mysticism. I mean, we've had people on the show talk about the relationship of even superhero comics to occultism, some of which are very dense stories, and yet because the culture itself is kind of so, in many ways, not entirely, but in many ways bound up with these commercial forces that are kind of designed to sell you the fantasy you want, rather than to go, hey, this world of fantasy is something you have inside you too, and why don't you go exploring? You kind of want to get that side of things going.
Yeah, and it's interesting what you said at the start of the show of it compared to religious imagery, because I hadn't really thought about that. But if you have any interest in art history, or if you go to art school, you really do have to you're going to have to study a lot of Christian stuff. And, that's the history of art. If you're studying Western art, and you separate the two, and it is very strange to the idea of putting them back together. Really turns a lot of people off.
Yeah.
Well, it is. It's weird, and if you look, you can even go further back than further back than Christian stuff. I mean, what were the first things that people were drawing pictures of? Right? What was some of the first things that people felt compelled to draw? Okay, well, you can say, like, caveman type of stuff, and what was in caveman type of stuff? Okay, there was, like, hunting scenes and stories, it's true, but then they also had all the crazy supernatural, monstery, like, shaman weird pictures of half animal, half people. So it had this kind of religious fantasy.
And everything is radiating. Everything that any human has ever drawn with the stick, back to cave paintings, half of it is they're trying to say, oh, I can draw what I see in reality, say this tree, but then there's always some kind of stuff radiating off of it. Always.
I think it's wonderful. Let's stay on this radiation topic.
And that's a pretty human response. So I'm going to draw this, and then I'm going to draw some lines radiating off of it.
Yeah, even they just found some evidence for some of the oldest paintings yet, which were sort of pigment had been sprayed over human hands, so you see the outline of the silhouette of the human. And they just dated these things back to like 45,000 BC, so they're like they're like again, they just they keep pushing it back farther and farther. And then when you think about some of those other early the cave art at at the Siobhan Cave that Werner Herzog made that wonderful film about, that even when they're doing very realistic, even very modern-looking kind of depictions of animals that are somewhat stylized but still pretty realistic, they often overlap them. So you still get this sort of sense of like radiating energy bodies that are overlapping, even as the actual images are very concrete. And you obviously, like, a lot of your stuff is very radiant, so that I'm just looking through it right now, and there's some wonderful pages where you have like a figure who's pretty simply drawn, but with a good outline, and then they're swimming in these fields of all these other lines, and then their figure becomes sort of indistinguishable from all these other radiating lines, so you get this sense of all these sort of energetic patterns that are constantly moving through physical form. What's your inspiration for that way of drawing? I mean, if it's not even specifically about...
A lot of it was even, I think, was the development of using the language of cartoons and comic books. There's always these radiating lines coming out of people. And one thing that actually, probably about halfway through doing this process, I kind of discovered something that I started reading thought forms, the Annie Besant and Leadbeater Theosophical book, about their, the way of all this, they're very specific in all those drawings about how thoughts are formed and how they radiate out of your brain, and they grow as clouds and affect other people. And as I'm looking at all these drawings, I suddenly realized that's the language of comic books. That's a thought balloon. It's the exact same thing. That's what it is. And then I suddenly thought, where the hell did thought balloons in comics come from? And thinking about the timeline of like the early 20th century, I'm like, well, that's around the same time that this structure was being put in place. Everyone knows that a cloud with words in it means that's what someone's thinking, and that's a language that everyone understands how to read a cartoon now. And so I think a lot of it was just slowly developing and pushing that stuff.
Yeah, it's a wonderful connection because, art historians have begrudgingly, in some cases, have to come to acknowledge the role that thought forms, that book, and theosophy in general played in the creation of modern abstract art. Like modern abstract art emerges in some ways directly from theosophy. Kandinsky was very influenced by theosophical ideas. So the idea of using abstraction to try to describe the sort of etheric world as an artistic strategy goes into the high art tradition. But I think your reading of it as also going into the playful, non-realistic elements of cartooning is really powerful. I think that's a really interesting way of thinking about it. And another way, another connection, I think, is that from the late 19th century on in mysticism, in popular culture, in popular science, across the board, there's the rise of the idea of energy, whether it's electricity or radiation or wireless telegraphy. And so when you see those lines, and it goes back to the earliest, cartoons. You see it in Nancy. You see it in, earlier in Little Nemo. You'll see these radiating lines, and it's like they're trying to capture this new invisible field of energy that now we're completely immersed in all the time on multiple. We're swimming in this stuff.
If you try and think about it, it's a little bit much to handle at this point.
Yeah.
I agree.
I feel like when people were first starting talking about, like, can you imagine the radio waves are going through you? And now it's just like, there's emails flying, there's text messages flying through my face all the time. It's like too much.
So what started your interest in the esoterics, that you came out of other interests and, your whatever, but like what really like caught your eye or started to open up your own studies and your own experience?
California. Los Angeles.
Wonderful.
It was definitely something. I was already in the process, but when I came across your book, Erik, it kind of, I'm like, this is what's fascinating me. It was able to, your Visionary State book, I was able to look at it and be like, I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but I was like, yes, it's these kinds of things. I'm from the East Coast. I'm from Boston, and having moved to Los Angeles, I just found there being a really different attitude and culture in general here, and the kind of way that people look at things, and a general acceptance of more mystery and imagination here. That kind of led me into this stuff, and I also ended up at Maj's lectures and was surprised by them. And then I had never heard of the Philosophical Research Society where they were being held, and all of that interested me, and then all of the different ways of looking at such things here in LA really got me excited. And then I also, in my own feelings towards culture in general, I was really put off by negativity and sarcasm and the way that it pervades in dystopia, the way it pervades every aspect of our culture, our popular culture. And being a cartoonist and an artist, I can't ignore these things. I'm part of them. And I just really needed an antidote because it wasn't working for me anymore. And then the idea of creating anything utopic or positive whatsoever causes such a, weird reaction in people. And I've even the idea of having a somewhat positive utopic fantasy, which is what part of my book creates, makes people go, you can't have a positive fantasy? Why, that's just ridiculous.
Well, and that's really
along. But it's not ridiculous to have a film where everything gets destroyed and aliens come and eat everyone. That's not ridiculous at all.
Well, if you look at the history of comics,
maybe people aren't entertained by things that are positive. And I actually did find there's a lot of things that Manly Hall wrote about these same things. I think because he was in Hollywood that I came across in reading about that stuff. But I was like, oh wow, these are really similar ideas to what I'm having.
Well, and a lot of
it opened up to me, and there was so much for me to be fascinated with because there's just so many different avenues to go down, and I don't need to be serious about any of them. I'm kind of ended up being entertained by so many of these different things because a lot of them are just so funny and fun.
Well, and you don't see that much ironically, in a lot of comics. And if you look at the beginning of where comics come out of, it's satire and criticism and, making fun of things. And like you said, like the opposite of creating this positive fantasy. Instead, they kind of originated as tearing things down. Obviously not all of them, but, I love Mad Magazine more than almost anything. So it's not
sure. Me too.
I don't like the satirical element of it. However, like you said, there is a kind of huge block for using the medium in that manner, and there's just not that many cartoonists, especially now. That you look at most of the most famous cartoonists now, most of them are satirists, and they are dystopian, and it's all like kind of it's very 90s in its sort of apathy and criticisms of pop culture, but doesn't offer any kind of alternative or solution. So I think when the artist presents the fantastical, optimistic kind of view, it's almost like not just criticizing, but like, offering an alternative way of thinking and presenting things, which always gets me excited.
Yeah. And it can be done with comedy and,
Well, one of the
self-criticism in a light kind of a way as well,
Well, one of the things that I really appreciate, though, that I think that is also a little bit, that is kind of edgy about your work, even if it's positive, is that it's not giving the reader a lot of really easy narrative characterological handholds. Like, it's not saying, okay, here we are, here's this, like in a lot of the sort of autobiographical vein of alternative comics, where it's like, here I am, here's my girlfriend, we're getting in a fight, and I'm walking down the street, and I'm thinking about this thing, and I go to a record store. So it's like, okay, I can slot in here. And you're not telling the story about two hipsters who live in Silver Lake who discover a magical sigil or whatever. You're giving, like, slices of a kind of teaching.
Yeah, my work's difficult on purpose. At first, probably a decade ago, it was difficult because I was confused, but now I know exactly what I'm doing with the difficultness of it. And, I don't really want to write stories. I don't want to create work that's a script for a film. Other people can do that. And I am more interested in, if I was a painter, I'd be doing much more conceptual work. I'm interested in pushing the medium and doing something that's harder to access. With comics are, always kind of exist in this place that has some kind of normalness to it, but I'm more interested in conceptual sides to art. And I wanted to make a book that would be hard to access, so that if you wanted to, you could do the work, and you'd have to go further in than just the surface to get anything from it.
Yeah,
and you might not want to read, it in order, and you might have it around for a few years, and then come across one panel one day, and be inspired by that. So I kind of was trying to create something more along those lines.
Yeah, I think
and people seem to react positively to it. So.
Yeah, and I also appreciate the way that the relative lack of shading it flattens the field, so that the bodies are more or less two-dimensional against two-dimensional surfaces. And again, it's harder for the eye that wants to fall into a three-dimensional space. Okay, I'm in a three-dimensional world. I can orient myself or whatever. Instead, you're bringing back something that is actually much truer to the history of, occult diagrams and glyphs and thought forms and, things that go, alchemical diagrams, where there's, even if it's a scene, there's a kind of flattening, almost as if, the classic examples are Orthodox icons. One of the things about looking at traditional Orthodox icons, which were mystical objects of contemplative prayer in the Orthodox Church, is that they're very flat. And in fact, they're designed so that things like overlapping parts of the body are supposed to be part of these kind of flattened designs. And some of that really comes through strongly with some of your images too. So I'm glad you've been winnowing your difficult style. Does it ever feel frustrating? You're like, God, if I was just a little more pop, maybe I'd get more attention and I'd communicate to people more.
No, not really.
Good for you.
No, I have my drawings are also very cute. And I do my illustration work. I'm able to hone the kind of cuteness, cartooniness to it, and that kind of gets across. I think if my stuff was wasn't as kind of sweet and happy looking, it would be a different thing. I think that if it was kind of more, what I was doing was more grotesque, it would be really difficult for people. But I've somehow developed this kind of cuteness to my style. And even my lettering, I've used all the bubble lettering in this book, which makes it even harder to read, which I kind of did on purpose as well, to make you, if you want to read it, you have to really look at it. But it is true that I've noticed recently, because I'm really up close to my drawings, but if you put them on a wall and take a picture of them, the paper just looks white.
Yeah.
Because it all turns, if you blur your eyes at this, and it just turns to gray, which is kind of interesting. And like a magic eye kind of thing.
Yeah, definitely. Well, we're going to take a break. Now you're listening to Expanding Mind with Erik Davis and Majid Dawa. We're talking with Ron Regé about his new Cartoon Utopia, and we'll be right back.
Welcome back to Expanding Mind on the Progressive Radio Network. This is Majid Dawa. We're here with Erik Davis, talking with Ron Regé Jr. about his fantastic new book called The Cartoon Utopia, put out by Fantagraphics. And a lot of the subject matter in the book is occult, esoteric, also scientific, basically looking at the operating forces behind the scenes in the universe. And, I was just curious myself personally, Ron, if you have ever read the comic Cerebus by Dave Sim. You know what I'm talking about? The one with the aardvark?
I have read it, but I didn't give it the work that it needed.
It needs
I remember
so much
of
work.
course I remember. Yeah,
so
and I never really.
epic.
I remember reading it in high school when I was really young, and I only remember accessing it as a kind of Lord of the Rings style fantasy world. It just very briefly, but I've always known that there's more to it, and that I should put the work into it. And actually, now that you say that, maybe I need to finally. Because I never really got far enough into it to know what was behind it.
Yeah, well, and it doesn't really develop until later on, but the reason I asked, I don't know if anybody out there has read it, because I know, first of all, it's obscure, and second of all, it's extremely arduous, and there is a lot of work that you have to put into it. And my ex-husband was a huge fan of it, and that was how I got exposed to it. And it basically is, he tries to create his own, like, exegesis, like, kind of, like, cosmology within the comic, and he's the only other kind of person I feel like that's gotten into the depths of, like, the forces behind the scenes in that comic. He looks at Kabbalistic things, like how the universe was created, like Big Bang, and incorporates some of the religious concepts along with the science stuff, which is, you just really, other than your book, I haven't seen in pretty much any other place. But it's like, I don't even know how many volumes of it there are. There's something stupid, like 12 volumes. I don't even know.
Right. But you can get them now. I remember looking at it when they were coming out 30 pages at a time.
Yeah, right.
And now you can actually get the hundreds of pages all together. I should probably do that.
I mean, it's like I said, it's arduous.
But I didn't really know that he was. I didn't know that he was trying to delve into that stuff quite specifically.
Yeah, like, I mean, he puts the Tetragrammaton in there, and like I said, gets into the Big Bang and like all that kind of stuff. But yeah, I feel like that was another thing I totally love about some of the stuff you chose to include in the book, which is the scientific kind of aspect of it. And how, do you want to talk about maybe how you started to feel about science?
Yeah, just a little bit. Yeah, and and a lot of that comes from the nature of your lectures as well, because you have a background in both, and I think that probably my kind of general wondering, and I did actually a couple of science comics before I did this, and when you're watching Nova or something like that. I'm as much of a spiritual novice as a scientific novice. I just look at these things, but I started to see where I was like, wow, the further reaches of science seem to be very close to the furthest reaches of spirituality. And maybe a lot of it comes from being in Boston, too, because there's so much of that kind of in the air there with MIT and that kind of stuff that I was just like, wow, there's what is, I feel like people were trying to tell me, they're like, oh, there's the nature of matter, doesn't exist, the physical world, in a spiritual sense. People were saying this to me. I'm like, that's crazy. This piece of wood is right here. No. And then, I hear about in science the space between atoms and, the idea of there being multiverses and stuff like that. I was like, and then I kind of thought, I was like, well, they seem so opposed to each other. But it seems like in the furthest reaches, they're talking about the same stuff.
Yeah.
So, I wanted to get that in there. And then also I've always had an interesting outsider artists, kind of like the kind of romantic ideas of like whether they be artists or scientists, mad scientists on the edge, and reading about Tesla, trying to understand what it was that he was doing. Got really into Wilhelm Reich, his ideas and that kind of stuff, and that they reminded me a lot of the kind of like artists on the fringe as well that I had been interested in. And just working outside of things and what it was they were talking about, and what where it is.
One connection with both those figures, they're very different, is that they both are playing with and reframing ideas of energy. That you have Tesla with his not only the alternating current, but also the idea of wireless power, of radiating power, of proto radio, of contacting other worlds through the radio. And then over here with Reich, you have an embodied form of those ideas, that there's a kind of energy in the world, an occult energy that goes back through the ages, but he reformulates in these kind of modern psychodynamic, psychophysical terms. But it's also, once again, about the radiating, energetic body. And to me, that's a lot of what the kind of core vision that's going through the Cartoon Utopia is, whether you think about it in electromagnetic, cosmic physics terms, or you think about it in esoteric terms, or just in cartoon terms, that we're not just walking around in these solid objects, encountering other solid objects. We're also always swimming in fields of energy that are both scientific from some perspectives and more esoteric from other perspectives.
Well, and probably the biggest thing that probably excited me about all of this was the idea of alchemy. And all of these things that we're talking about lead into that, because before Masha, I think before you did a zine on alchemy. I feel like I got it a couple of years before your lectures, and I remember picking it up and being like, what the hell is this? Which is what people say to me who are from the outside. I'll be like, really, what are you into these days, Ron? I usually just say alchemy, and they're like, what the hell are you talking about? Because if you're not involved in anything in this realm, you're just like, I think I heard of that once. It's about turning lead into gold. It's some crazy old shit.
Yeah.
Which is like I just never really thought that much about it at all. And then just even looking, having a little bit of it explained, I'm like, oh, this is really interesting, and it really led me to see a unity between all belief systems all over the world always. And I hadn't thought about the birth of science at all before. And so seeing that and being like, oh, this is really interesting, this idea of like where science came from and what they're looking for, this mysterious philosopher's stone and all these systems of discovering it seem kind of entertaining and arcane, but the more you get into it, the more it really makes sense on so many different
and it's still
levels.
pertinent. I mean, it's still apropos because it's what they're still looking for in this Wing particle accelerator. Like, it's still happening, you know what I mean?
Yep.
Yeah.
And then how much does alchemy help illuminate your own like work process? Like, because there is a lightness to your work, a kind of friendly quality, and you're not like, unlike a lot of esoteric comics, even including Doctor Strange, but certainly Alan Moore, Grant Morrison, or whatever, where they have these occult elements. They're also like heavy cats, and you get this sense of like this kind of heavy, sort of twisted energy that they're going through their own chapel perilous. That does not radiate from your work so much. Do you go through your own kind of nigredo, your own sort of black night that leads to the lightness?
It's really interesting. I've been talking about that a lot with my friends lately. I think I'm in the stage after that. I think I've been through the nigredo.
Good.
I'm in the lunar return, I think. That I can look back on I recognize it when I see I know I've got another one coming up. But yeah, I definitely do. There is a lot of darkness, and I've never really it's underneath in my work, really, and I've always had this I don't know why, I've always had this wanting to keep this kind of sweetness, positivity to it, and if anything, I'm also interested in the trickster idea as an artist. To always be kind of winking at you. To always be kind of like, yeah, of course there is darkness to things, but how about this? It's really happy. And I've also felt in my work of the last bunch of years that's, I think when I was younger, in the 80s and 90s, kind of sarcasm and negativity and poking fun at culture made sense. But now things have gone so far that the only way to really be pushing things and to confuse people and to shock them out of, which is what an artist really wants to do, is to kind of shock people out of their stupor into being amazed, is to be really positive and to be really loving and to be really unrelenting about it.
Yeah.
I play in this band Lavender Diamond as well, and that's been our message and our way of kind of like being as revolutionary as possible, to be really unrelenting with that.
It's funny.
Right underneath it, of course, there's sadness and there's confusion to being in this crazy society that we've created that I don't understand why or how it happened this way, and to really like go at it as much as you can with love and with a positive idea to just show people,
It's a crazy struggle. I've been rereading a lot of Robert Anton Wilson lately because I'm writing a piece on him, and I was like, God, I haven't read those books in a long time. Let's go back, and started plowing through the nonfiction mostly. And one of the things that came away with us at reading this is going like, wow, I mean, he was a pretty heavy cat. He was in these occult scenes and paranoid conspiracy politics and weird synchronicities and heavy drugs and a real, the 70s were like a real kind of weird dark time in the counterculture because the hippie dream wasn't going to be real. There's this heavy sense of things that had to do with some of the energies, and there's a very real comic book overlap with a lot of the satire and a lot of the pulp fiction stuff that he's doing. But there's this thread of optimism, a friendly, grounded, twinkly-eyed, friendliness, and he is willing to use the word love on occasion and talk about optimism. And I was like, my God, that's what's missing, is the combination of the kind of the bullshit radar, which we all have really good bullshit radars now, or at least most of us. At least a lot of people that I know, and then, but it can be poisoning. You're like you don't let yourself go on the other side. And how to balance that out alchemically, or however you want to think about it, with some kind of genuine optimism, sense of lightness, sense of possibility, even in the face of the challenges. And and art and imagery, it's a great way to do it.
And I think that you can sense, talk about bullshit detector, I think that you can sense when someone is trying to be positive and light in a way that they haven't processed the darkness and they're using it as a way to avoid it, as a lot of stuff in this, you can sense it when you see it, you know, when it's like, oh, this person's really, they're putting out this positive message, but they're really looking for ego fulfillment or some kind of, you know, they're looking to get one up, you know, compete or get something up on someone else, and you know you can feel it. But the only if you've kind of like understood the darkness to its depths in your own life and your own work, then you can present the light side in a way with a way of understanding both together. Mm-hmm. And I sense it when I see it in other people's work, and I try and present it in my own as well.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. And the flip side is just as true, where people can hide in their cynicism because it's all about how the world is screwed up, or other people are screwed up, or the whole structure is screwed up, or whatever the thing is, and you're like, that all may be perfectly true, like how it's all like a rigged game, necessarily screwed up from the get-go, and yet, for better or worse, we have these things inside of us, and unless you're actually going through and looking at your own shadow and seeing the ways that you are complicit with those systems and being honest about that, you're also kind of dodging, and it's kind of an ego game. And until you start to do that, and you can do that from a perspective where you don't even lose your pessimistic view necessarily, but you become a more alive person, a more connecting person, a more compassionate person. And I've seen people do that.
Depends on how you reflect it back. Depends on how you reflect it back and how you take your own responsibility on how you're reflecting it. You know,
exactly.
Well, and I mean that's a constant, consistent problem in religion and science. Also, is, you know, C.S. Lewis did that book, The Problem of Pain and the Problem of Suffering. It's like just because there's gnarly stuff, does that mean like you just give up and like that's it or whatever? Like how do you handle it? How are you going to handle that stuff? Are you gonna turn it into something? Are you gonna let it consume you? And that's the constant problem with the nature.
Or do you pretend like everything is really great until you crack?
Yeah.
You know?
So, we see where that goes, you know. Yeah. So it is. But then, are you gonna make a joke about it and not let it eat you, but still deal with it, or are you just gonna like brush it under the rug and pretend everything is like totally hunky dory, you know? Which I think is implicit in your title, Cartoon Utopia. And maybe you could explain like a little bit why you called it Utopia and where that came out of.
I think when I came across the idea of the word, when the first time I wrote it down or thought of it, I was like, this is a great catchphrase. I'm using this for everything. I'm like, that just sounds great. And it's worked out pretty when I feel like I finally, I've always kind of, when I meet people and they're like, oh, you're a cartoonist, what is your book called? And I'm like, I do a bunch of different books, and they're always about different things, and they have different weird names. Skibberby-Bye, you're not going to remember that. You know, so now I have something. I'm like, Cartoon Utopia. Just write that down, and people remember it. So that I was like, it seemed like a very good catchphrase to me as soon as I heard of it, and I was like, that's what I'm going to use. But putting both words together. You know, what is a cartoon? You know, like, and everyone understands what that is. It's not reality. It's the opposite. And utopia is kind of the same way. They kind of go together, you know. There's kind of a utopic idea to cartoons in general, in the most basic sense of what they are.
What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, of course, there's like cartoons are for kids. Mickey Mouse is cute, you know. In the way, you know, and they're very simple. The idea of utopia, if you say utopia, it seems like a very simple idea. Everything's perfect, utopia, you know. And cartoons are also very simplified. You know, it's like 2 dots in a line, a smiley face, you know. It's like the world is uncomplicated in the most basic sense of what a cartoon is. So everything is very simplified, and utopia kind of, in the broadest sense, kind of says that as well. Like everything, can't everything just be simple? You know?
Yeah. Well, I'm also thinking of like, you know, little Nemo, and the sort of, you know, in some sense, one of the first fully expressed comic.
Dream-based, yeah.
And it sort of shows you how, like, the comic space itself then becomes a place where another world can be created, the world of dream, the world of, fantasy unleashed.
Well, both words kind of mean that as well, yeah.
Yeah,
kind of like
so
a dream place that you might not be able to achieve exactly, but it's, can look towards it. I started off with this project with the very base. I thought I was going to write a more science fiction-y narrative that would be called the Cartoon Utopia, where everyone was living in a utopia, and I was going to start making comics in that realm, and I was doing it with single drawings, a lot of which are kind of in the end part of the book, and I was just doing it panel by panel, and I was like, I'm going to make this, an actual universe of how I think everything could work out. But as I started to get into it, I wasn't as interested in doing that literally as I thought, and then I think probably in the middle of making those drawings, started going to Maj's lectures, and then kind of like started reading so much stuff that I wanted to take notes on, and then that's what created the rest of the book. So the original idea that I was actually going to do a regular story called the Cartoon Utopia, and I was going to show everybody what it would be like.
That's hard to do.
It's for real.
It was hard to do. Yeah, it was hard to do, and I was like, I don't know. And then even my ideas were always changing about what how we could move forward and fix things, And I was going to present this idea of, and I'm always kind of on the fence of it myself. I'm like, well, we've got all these great new technologies and everything, and I know that we can make electric vehicles that use, we can have solar stuff that, it seems like we could use all the technology we've created to really have a very interesting world where we're not using fossil fuels or whatever, or, to bring everyone in society up to a certain level or something. Like, it seems like so many people want that, and we could use it. And so I was trying to write that narrative, but then at the same time I also go back and forth being like, no, there's no way that that's an answer, and we can't have anything, and we've got to go back to a primitive way of living, and our society just doesn't work at all. And I have no more of an answer to that than anyone else does, really. So I wasn't able to write a comic about it, and I think that if I had, I would have, by the time it came out, I would have been like, I'm not sure. I can't sign on to that exactly. So I'm kind of glad.
Well, but that's hilarious to me, because that's the nature that these things go in. They're so cyclical. Like, someone will have a utopia, and it'll be that utopia, and then it falls and crumbles. Like, empires and societies are built and fall, very much like you just said. Like, someone will have this idea, and look at communism. Okay, there's this very well thought out philosophy and idea, and then they intend to structure a society around it, and then they're like, well, maybe not. Maybe we'll do this instead. So, I mean, that's
maybe I want that, and you can't have it.
Yeah,
I don't want to share that with you, actually.
Actually, I changed my mind. So, I mean, that... No, it is. It's inherent and implicit in the human condition, not only in a comic book, but in our greater society. So it's pretty hilarious that is, how you express it, because it's a microcosm of the whole freaking thing itself,
Yeah. But at least with the name like the Cartoon Utopia, it's interesting it being out now. I wasn't sure. My work has always been kind of difficult, and I've always kind of been on the edges of the comic book world, and the general idea of my work is that it's very confusing and very strange. And so I felt that I was pushing it with this book. I'm like, I might as well just push it, make it as confusing and strange as I possibly can. I'll call it the Cartoon Utopia. And I didn't think people were going to be as interested in it as they have been, and I've been very surprised to just see how much it attracts people and kind of lights their eyes up when they see it or think of it. And I'm actually really surprised, because I thought it would be more that people would just be like, Ron knew this crazy book. He's really gone off the deep end.
Well, with that, Ron, we're going to have to end it. Ron Regé, the Cartoon Utopia. Thanks so much for being on Expanding Mind.
Thank you very much.
All right,
Thanks,
for me and
Ron.
Majid Ali out there, keep your minds open.